So for this first lesson in geometry, we're just going to start by discussing what shapes are and a few other things. So we're going to ignore the first question because it says what are the parts of this triangle. That's talking about a specific triangle in the section that we're not going to actually be looking at. So let's just talk about by defining straight. Something is straight if it is not curved, or if it doesn't turn. So as long as it isn't curved or doesn't turn, then it is something that is going to be considered straight. So it could also be defined, the most probably technical definition is that it is the shortest distance connecting two points, and that's technically the mathematical definition for straight, but that's not something you necessarily need to know at this point. So the next part it asks us to talk about is how would you define a point? Well, a point is something that represents a location. A point represents a location. So typically when we talk about a point, we're talking about a point that's on a grid, on a graph, and it's an ordered pair. It's a coordinate, which means that it's an X and then a Y, and that's how most of the points that we talk about are going to be represented. Sometimes in geometry we'll talk about points as vertices, or the corners of where two line segments meet. So speaking of line segments, a line segment is a straight line with two endpoints. It's a straight line with two endpoints. Sometimes in math it's a lot better to see a picture than it is to see a definition, and so if I were to draw a picture of that, it would have a dot, and it would be connected. That is a line segment. So we're going to skip over to the next page of your notes. There isn't much on this slide that we really need to cover. Just as a refresher, remember that an equilateral triangle means all sides are equal. And if something is a right triangle, that means it has a right angle. So it's going to look like this, and it'll have a right angle in the corner. We're going to skip down to this part here on page 12. It says geometry is based in part on the practice of describing objects and the relationship between them. It's going to be about describing objects and the relationship between them, how they're connected, how they're similar, how they're different. That's the majority of what geometry is about. So we're going to do a couple of the problems from the checkup. I'm going to go over the odd problems with you, and then you'll be expected to do the even problems on your own. So the first one for the odd problem, it gives you this picture up here with shapes A through I, and it asks, first of all, which figures have three sides, or call if it has three sides as a triangle. So in this case, I'm just literally listing out everything that has three sides, which C and I both have three sides, and they are the only shapes that have three sides. Number 3 says which figure has 5 sides. Anything that has 5 sides would be called, the technical definition or the technical word for it is a pentagon. May be helpful to write that down. So a pentagon, anything that has 5 sides is considered a pentagon. And so I'm looking for anything with 5 sides. Well, F has 5 sides and D has 5 sides. So those would be our pentagons. Just by the way, anything that has 4 sides is technically considered a quadrilateral. I'm going to write that over here. That would be considered a quadrilateral. Underneath quadrilateral, you have trapezoids, rectangles, parallelograms, squares, rectangles, and a bunch of other different shapes, rhombus. But the overall arching name for a four-sided figure is a quadrilateral. So number 5 says which figures have exactly one pair of sides that appear to be equal in length. Anytime you have a pair of sides that are equal in length, that is something that is considered isosceles. Okay, if they have a pair of sides that are equal in length, it's something isosceles. It could be an isosceles trapezoid. It could be an isosceles triangle. So in this case, they want to know which of these have one pair that is equal. Well, G would have that. And because this particular question said which pair has exactly one pair of sides, that means it does not have 2 pairs or 3 pairs. It has exactly one pair of sides. G is actually our only answer. You could argue that A has a pair of equal sides. And B as well. Technically, A and B have 2 pairs of equal sides, and that's why we cannot answer that for question 5. So if we move on to question 7. So again, we have a picture down here, and 7 says which have 4 sides, which as we discussed earlier would make it a quadrilateral. Well, B has 4 sides. E, F, and H all have 4 sides. And number 9 says which figures have sides that are all the same length. In that case, that would make it equilateral of some sort, and the only shape that has that is B. Something to keep in mind on this quiz is that if it appears to all be equal, it's going to all be equal. They're not going to play a game with you because they don't give you actual measurements where you're like, well, I think this one might be a little bit longer. No, if they look like they're the same, then they are.